Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to another lecture of English literature in the Renaissance. This is lecture number 2. We talked in the first lecture about the Reformation, the causes of the Reformation, and the events of the Reformation, the development of Protestantism, the problems of the Catholic Church, etc., etc. In the second lecture, we will talk about trade and explorations. One of the biggest events in that contributed to the development of Renaissance literature and Renaissance culture in general was trade and exploration. And this is important because it brought tremendous wealth to Europe. European countries all of a sudden became wealthy and became in control of some of the major trade routes in the world. So this lecture is going to give you a summary of some of these travels and the contributions of each of the European countries, mostly Portugal, France, Britain, and Holland. And then we will talk about some of the scientific developments that facilitated the development of trade and commerce and exploration. So one way to understand the development of trade and commerce and exploration is to realize that it had three incentives. We can describe them very easily as being gold, God, and glory. Gold, God, and glory. Gold because travel and exploration, Europeans going overseas to look for trade routes, to look for gold, to look for minerals, to look for wealth, right? And gold because these travels and explorations were also motivated by religious zeal. Europeans wanted to go abroad to spread Christianity, to convert native populations to Christianity, to Protestantism in the case of England, to Catholicism in the case of Spain, and so on. And glory because travel and explorations guaranteed fame. Fame not only for the people who undertook the voyage and the exploration and the travel, but fame and glory even for his nation, the nation, whether that's France or Italy, and of course these travels were not individual initiatives. Most of the time they were sponsored by monarchs, by kings and states of Europe. So for example, the travels of Christopher Columbus, who was himself Italian, but his travels were sponsored by the king and queen of Spain. The same thing for the British sailors and explorers. So the story of these explorations and travels doesn't start with the Renaissance. It's a little bit older than that. It really starts with the Crusades. The Crusades that start in the 11th century when the Catholic Church and the Pope decided to urge Christians to go liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims. So the Crusades lasted for 300-400 years of ferocious invasions of Palestine and Syria mostly, and of course the occupation of Jerusalem for 100 years until it was liberated by Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, as we all know. The Crusades essentially tried to dislodge the Muslims from Jerusalem from a religious perspective, but they also had other dimensions that are less known. One of the most important reasons behind the Crusades was The Europeans tried to dislodge the Muslims from trade routes. The Europeans wanted trade routes. And the connection later on, when Christopher Columbus will go to America, will travel to America, in his diaries, he said that he wanted to find a back door to Jerusalem. He wanted to travel around so he can find a back door to Jerusalem, which shows that in 1492, Christopher Columbus was still motivated by a crusader zeal. So the Crusades were a big loss for Europe. They lost a lot of money, a lot of fighters, but Europe learned a lot of things too. And the most important, they learned how to draw maps, right? And they learned how to sail seas, right? And these are very important things for any emerging nations. And you add to that the fall of Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, Granada especially in 1492, the fall of Al-Andalus put a huge reservoir of wealth, the wealth of the Muslims of Al-Andalus, and a huge reservoir of scientific knowledge in the hands of Europe for the first time. So of course this reservoir of wealth and knowledge will contribute to, you know, the exploration and the travels. Notice also the connection between the Crusades, the fall of Al-Andalus, and the explorations. For example, Granada fell in 1492, and I think the exact month is January of 1492. Columbus went, traveled across the Atlantic and found the Americas in the same year of 1492, the same year Granada fell. But that was in the month of August, so there is a space of 6 months between the fall of Granada and Columbus landing in the Americas. So at this point the explorations began. Al-Andalus has fallen, the Crusades have been a big loss, but also Europe learned a lot from the Crusades, and the explorations begin. Essentially Portugal, France, England and Spain led the exploration and colonization movement and built empires across the Americas, in North and South Americas, and in Africa, Asia and Australia. But essentially it was these states, Portugal, Spain, England and France mostly, that led the exploration and the colonization efforts. Portugal, it was Portugal that led the way. Portugal was a land of experienced sailors and they had traveled the seas before in search of trade for centuries before that. The Portuguese monarch, like Prince Henry the Navigator, he's named the Navigator because of his contribution to exploration work. Monarchs like Prince Henry the Navigator understood very quickly and early on their country's dependence on the sea, right? They depend on the sea, that's where they get their income from, and they eagerly financed exploration and exploration ventures. So very briefly I want to talk about Portugal and Portugal's experience. The Portuguese first explored the west coast of Africa, right? This is the west coast of Africa, and established trade in gold and slave there. So they started looking for gold and buying slaves on the west coast of Africa. Perhaps the most important Portuguese explorer is Vasco de Gama. In 1497, Vasco de Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope, it's the southern tip of Africa. It's the southern, you know, most southern point of Africa, where South Africa is today. So he sailed around it and continued all the way to India. Vasco de Gama and his crew, they were the first Europeans to find the route to India through the sea. Nobody did it before. Nobody managed to go to India exclusively using sea routes. So Vasco de Gama was the first one, and he essentially went from Portugal, sailed on the coast of West Africa to the southern point of Africa, and then all the way to India. This was very beneficial for Portugal, and it opened Portugal's appetite for further exploration. So then the Portuguese established settlements in Brazil and South America, and essentially looking also for gold and sugar. Portugal was more interested in trade than in taking over land. The Portuguese were not interested in keeping land. They were interested in trade, in finding routes. The land, they didn't want to sit and take care of it or control the native populations. By 1600, Portugal had established trading posts in important coastal areas of Africa and Asia. So in all the important spots on the coast of Africa and Asia, Portugal had very important trading posts already there. And it was very fast becoming the wealthiest and most powerful European nation. Except that Spain was also not far behind. Spain was a very fierce competitor for Portugal. Spain's exploration effort was led by an Italian explorer, the famous Christopher Columbus. In 1492, Columbus reached the Caribbean island, just off the coast of the Americas. He wasn't looking for America. He didn't know about America. Europe didn't know there was a continent behind the Atlantic. Columbus was looking for a route to Asia. He wanted to reach Asia, which was east of Europe, but he wanted to reach it going west. He accidentally found America while looking for essentially a western route to Asia. And of course, Columbus's voyage were a very important turning point in modern history. In 1510, Spain financed the voyage of Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan headed south and west, rounding the tip of South America and finally reaching the Philippines after 18 months at sea. So now not only the Europeans have gone south of Africa and circumvented Africa and went all the way to India, but they have done it on the other direction too, by going all the way to southern America and circumventing the southern tip of Southern America and going to the other side to the Philippines. So you can see that the world is becoming small. There is no areas that are difficult to sail, or there's no obstacles anymore in terms of movement, mobility. Europeans can move east or west and very easily. Magellan died there. He died there. But his crew returned home to Spain after circumventing the entire world and proving that the earth was round. This is the point when it was completely proven that the earth was round. It wasn't flat, it was round, because you can go from one side and turn around and come back to your starting point. Spanish explorers quickly conquered the powerful empires of the Aztecs and the Incas in the Americas. These were two huge empires. They weren't powerful militarily, but they were pretty sophisticated and civilized. They had buildings and even libraries and books and systems of writings and complex languages and culture and art and so on. But their methods of warfare were very rudimentary and very simple. So the Spanish the Spanish conquistadors found it very easy to conquer them and essentially destroyed large numbers of their populations and wiped out their civilization almost completely. The Aztecs and the Incas were civilizations in what we call today Peru and Mexico. The Spanish established colonies and destroyed these native civilizations and their populations. And the Spanish empire eventually became the largest and strongest of the colonial empires at the time. The Spaniards then used the gold and the silver of the Americas and financed military wars to take over Asian trades in spices, silk and clothes. So as you can see, Spain now is taking the lead, becoming the strongest empire and the wealthiest empire in Europe. So there is a fierce competition going on. Also, one thing that was very important and central to the Spanish work of exploration was religion. The Spaniards were very keen on spreading the Catholic religion to the areas that they were conquering. I mean, in terms of the claims, there is a lot of stress on religion, but even when you look at the details, very often the Spaniards had no pity on the populations that they controlled, and even if they converted to Christianity, they still most of the time were wiped out and killed using all sorts of methods of warfare that were devastating at the time. At this point, Spain is the biggest empire in Europe. The English and the French are still, still making baby steps trying to catch up with the Spaniards. The English, to begin their exploration and colonization and efforts, they started close to home. They started by invading Ireland in the 1500s. In Ireland, the English learned to send expeditions there. They developed a working relationship between the various wealthy noblemen in England who had the wealth and the military power to send men abroad, and the Queen of England at the time, Elizabeth. So the Queen would consent to send in various expeditions to Ireland, and they, practiced essentially colonialism in Ireland throughout the 1500s. In the 16th and 1700s, the English established tobacco plantations in the Caribbean and in the Caribbean islands. So they started with tobacco plantations, and they established colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America. So this is the east coast of America today. The English started by building the Jamestown colony there in the Jamestown plantation on the east coast, and tobacco plantations in the Caribbean. The colonists, the English colonists, were a mix of religious Puritans and pirates and mercenaries. In the 1600s, England chartered the East India Company. And this is a very important method that the European states and European countries used. They would charter a company. For the English, it was the East India Company, to trade in the East Indies, that's India and Southeast Asia. And soon the East India Company established a colonial presence in India. India eventually came under British rule in 1858. But the East India Company was not just a trading company. At some point it governed India and administered India and constituted the de facto government of India. England first explored Australia in the 1600s and established a strong colonial presence there in the late 1700s, after American colonies became independent. So once they lost the American colonies, the English went to explore in Australia. Also, something about the East India Company, it shows how the colonization and exploration effort was not simply a state effort. Most of the time it was wealthy, rich individuals who had the wealth, the money, and the military force. They had fighting men, right? And they could mobilize, for example, 30 ships or 15 ships with fighters and everything. And the government would give them a charter. For example, the King of England gave the Puritans a charter to go colonize North America, and this is how the colonization of North America started. These wealthy men would, pull resources together, 5, 10, 20, 30 of them. They would pull their money together and bring their fighters and forces together, and then the state, the government, would give them a charter permission to go colonize one part of the world or another. At this point, only the French are left behind. The French settled in North America after French explorer Samuel de Champlain. Samuel de Champlain founded the colony of Quebec in today's Canada. So immediately after Samuel de Champlain founded the colony of Quebec, the French started further settlement in North America. Quebec was established as a trading post, essentially a post where, it would be a trading post. They would bring merchandise there, they would ship it back to Europe, and then merchandise would come from Europe, and it would land there, and it would be distributed to other areas of the continent. So that would be, Quebec was a trading post, and from there, further colonization was undertaken. They moved after that down the Mississippi River and claimed the central part of what we call today of the United States, where the United States is today. The French controlled most of the central part of the United States. At this point, there is a rise of what we call mercantilism. Mercantilism, mercantile empires. They're empires that trade, right? This is a time before there was industry, before there was most of the economies is based on buying and selling, or growing products, tobacco, cotton, and so on, in one place of the world and selling them in another place of the world. So almost the trade of the world is based on mercantilism. But this mercantilism has developed hugely, tremendously, that there is, fast and complex products being moved east and west at a fast speed. Most of the time, it was the government that sponsored the ventures. The governments would sponsor them, but private partnerships, there would be private individuals that would join their efforts together. They would begin, it's what was called joint stock companies, joint stock. They would join their effort together and create a joint stock company, and the government would sponsor the effort. The reason behind it is that when you pool money together, there is limited liability. It's not just one person who's going to lose everything, but if there is like 30 wealthy individuals who contribute to a mercantile effort or colonization effort, if they lose, then the loss could be divided among the 20, 25, or 30 people, so it would have less of an impact. World trade shifts from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. This is very important transformation. World trade, before the Renaissance, world trade was concentrated on the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was the economic center of the world. With these explorations and mercantilism, world trade shifts from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic. Now it's the Atlantic that becomes the focus of the international trade. Nations now base their wealth, they count and calculate their wealth on the gold and silver that they have. And it's mostly acquired through mining or through trade. Also, the governments at this point begin to force their colonies to trade only with their parent company, right? So if you're the East India Company and you are sponsored by England, you can't go back and trade with Spain or France. You have to trade exclusively with England. And the same thing for the raw material. All the raw material that you get from these colonies, whether it's cotton, whether it's tobacco, whether if you're an English company, you can't take this raw material and sell it in France. You have to take it back to England. And the reason behind this is to make sure that all the wealth stays within the parent country of that specific company or that colonization effort. So if the English colonized North America, they have to trade exclusively with England. There was a huge social impact to these explorations and this expansion of trade. The population of the world grew exponentially. There is a massive population growth in the period between 1450 and 1650. So in these 200 years, the population of Europe grows from 55 million to 100 million. So in 200 years, the population of Europe doubles. The creation of the world trade at this point is based on what became known as the Columbian Exchange. And this Columbian Exchange, because it's based primarily on the movement within the Atlantic, there is new products that come in, products that were known in some parts of the world and not known in other parts of the world. So for example, there are items that weren't known in Europe before 1492, foods like beets or carrots or cherry or cinnamon, coffee for example, or grapes or lettuce or melon, olive for example, orange, rice, spinach. All of these were not known in Europe before 1492. And there are items that came only from the Americas. They only existed in America, like avocado, for example, only existed in the Americas and only started being imported to Europe after Columbus's voyage. Things like cacao bean, from which we make chocolate, also didn't exist in Europe and only became known after the colonization of the Americas. Same thing for chili pepper, corn, peanut, pineapple, pumpkin, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, turkey, and of course tobacco. And also another huge consequence of the travels and the trade and the explorations is that large numbers of people start to migrate to the New World to colonize it. And the colonies offer immigration opportunities to people in Europe who didn't have prospects of a good life. Now they can go to the Americas and have a plantation or a farm or something like this. The trade and the explorations also created the need for scientific discoveries, and of course it leads immediately, this is the time when we have that's leading to the scientific revolution. We have people like Nicholas Copernicus, who was born in Poland and contributed greatly to shattering some of the old beliefs that existed and creating a new way of looking at the world. He was one of the people who said that the earth was round and that it rotated in axis, and it revolved, it turned around the sun. He didn't publish his beliefs until he was near to his death, because he was afraid of the church and the punishment for that. And of course, after he died, his ideas were confirmed by the explorers. Other people like Johann Kepler. Kepler used math to prove that the earth revolved around the sun. And he also discovered planets, that he discovered that planets move in ellipses and at different speed. People like Galileo Galilei. Galileo built a telescope and observed several moons. He proved the theories of Copernicus. Copernicus just, you know, when he was close to his death, he published his theories and died, but he wasn't proven right until later on by Galileo. Well, Galileo, famously, as it's famously known, the church forced him to recant his belief. They forced him to take back his belief. Galileo also worked with physics and with motion. Other important thinkers that should be mentioned is Francis Bacon. Bacon was very important in establishing the workings of the scientific method. He was the one who explained how scientific method should work in a systematic fashion, that we reach truth through the use of evidence. It's no more a question of, like, you know, some blind belief here or some blind belief there, but it's a question of, you know, establishing methods, systematic methods of providing evidence and discovering truth. Also worth mentioning is René Descartes, who is known as the father of analytical geometry. And the important phrase of "I think, therefore I am." Descartes essentially questioned the existence of everything, including his own existence, and only realized that he exists when he realized that he thinks. I think, therefore I am. Isaac Newton also is very important in this regard. He was the first to recognize the concept of gravity, you know, the example of the apple falling to the floor, and the concept of gravity towards the earth. He wrote of the laws, what, you know, principias. They were laws, natural laws, and laws of the universe and galaxies and so on. He developed calculus to study changes in forces or quantities. Also worth mentioning are people like Andreas Vesalius, who recorded the information on the human anatomy, the structure of the human body, and so on. So it's no more a secret there. Of course, they're building on scientific, very important scientific work that was done in Al-Andalus by the Muslims in Al-Andalus. But, you know, Europe is developing these methods and internalizing them, in the sense that they are using them in organizing their own societies now. People like Robert Hooke, he used the microscope to study the body and discovered cells. As you can see, the Renaissance was the result, the culture of the Renaissance was the result of economic and scientific developments. These economic developments were the result of wars, essentially, the Crusades and the fall of Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus. So these wars brought wealth, and the wealth was invested in exploration, in further exploration, and travels, which these travels allowed Europe to gain trade routes, to gain control of trade routes, establish colonies, develop trade, build wealth, and the wealth, of course, created a culture of riches, a culture that produced the literature, the art, and the poetry that we will be talking about in the coming lectures. So we have to remember that the Renaissance did not usher in only an age of exploration and travels and literature only. We have to remember that there is winners and there is losers. So the travels and explorations and the scientific age also had losers, and these were the civilizations and the populations whose culture and civilization was destroyed by European travels and explorations. Many nations were destroyed in the areas that came under European control. Some, like the Mayans or the Incas, were very sophisticated communities. They had libraries and books and writings and knowledge and organized system of governance and so on. But they didn't have a system of military defense. So when the Europeans came, although the Europeans were small in number, they had firearms, they had cannons, and in front of these poor populations could not last. The Renaissance also brought in these explorations and international slave trade, also brought in the age of the international slave trade. And millions of Africans were kidnapped kidnapped in Africa and taken to plantations in the Americas, where they were forced into bondage and servitude. Of course, the impact is not just on the people that are being kidnapped and taken to the Americas. The slave trade impacted Africa in a way that we still see today. It emptied Africa of its population. It created a race for weapons among the tribes on the west coast of Africa because it became trading in captives became a source of money. So a lot of tribes on the west coast of Africa started raiding each other, taking captives to sell them to the Europeans. And the Europeans would only trade in captives. So for example, if you're an African tribe on the west coast of Africa and all you want is to buy some guns from the Europeans, well, the only money that the Europeans would accept for these guns would be captives. Even if you come and say, well, look, I have money, can I buy some of your guns? They would say, no, you can only buy these guns with captives. So the Europeans fueled the wars between the African tribes, and those wars fueled the slave trade. We shouldn't also forget that mercantilism and this new mercantile world order is laying the foundation of the modern capitalist system, which will get its second huge boost with the scientific and the industrial revolutions. There is also very important this is also the age where new and devastating methods of war are being tried and become, widespread at this point. Methods of warfare that are far more devastating and destructive than anything humanity had ever seen before. So the literature of the Renaissance that we will be discussing in the coming lectures did not appear simply because some people were creative and wrote some interesting and beautiful poems or plays, but it was the literature and the arts and the culture of the Renaissance came about because new socio-economic realities, new military realities, new political realities brought with it new cultures and new ways to look at the world and new ways to think and organize and communicate. This is all we have for this session. Thank you so much for paying attention, and I will see you in our next lecture. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.